APUSH, I'm going to walk you through some of the foreign policy and economic policy of the 1920s. What I want you guys to really understand is that both sort of literally and figuratively, the doors are going to be slammed shut on things like immigration, on international trade. And you guys know this is really an effort to sort of reject that internationalism we saw at the end of World War One. And it's going to have some good and some bad. I mean, the United States will, I guess, delay entering the Great Depression, which you know is a worldwide event, which a good amount of Europe was involved in already in the 1920s. But it's certainly delaying the inevitable because of some of the policies that are held during this time. And the isolationism that we're going to see certainly isn't going to stop the rise of fascist and totalitarian dictators. So, it's a double-edged sword. I think there's a lot of good to take away from this as far as what to do and also what not to do, and some of the naivety that we're going to see. So, okay, so we know there is some lingering Allied war debt from World War One, and there's just this sort of desire. Warren Harding ran on this to return to normalcy and go back to the way things were. The choice of presidents we're going to see in the 1920s. We have a series of three Republican kind of supply side classic fiscal conservative presidents. And so we're going to see that they're going to make some choices here that are going to affect us later on. War debt status, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany all owed a ton of money for their debt from World War One. Germany, of course, had the reparations to deal with. And it was just not working. And you guys have seen the pictures of the German children, playing with stacks of money because it's worth nothing. Inflation was out of control. So the Dawes Plan in 1924 was when the United States started to loan Germany some money and also canceled a good chunk of Italy and France's debt. And then later on, we'll see the Young Plan, which reduced Germany's debt from the original, remember, $30 billion price tag down to 8,032,000, or 8 billion, I'm sorry, $32,500,000 payable over 58 and a half years at an interest rate of 5.5%. Fun fact, Germany just paid off their World War One debt on October 3rd, 2010. So they did pay off their debt. But we have just the collapse of the debt system because of this worldwide depression. So needless to say, the United States wants to stay out of this. Okay, now we've already talked to a good amount of this and the tension that we see, rural versus urban, sort of this international versus isolationist tension that's going on through the 20s. I'm going to pull in a little bit more. You guys know that the Klan was growing. And you also we've heard before from the farmers. The farmers have tried to really kind of push forward with the Populist Party. They were largely ignored. Here, farmers really struggled, and we had a bill that would have provided some aid and some relief to farmers, and it was vetoed by President Coolidge. So we're going to see that the farmers are not involved in the Roaring 20s. The 20s might be roaring for a lot of people, but they're definitely not roaring for the farmers. They were already struggling by 1929, and that's going to make things even worse when that market crashes. The other thing I want to point out to you on this slide is we are going to effectively slam the doors shut to almost all immigrants in the 1920s. Okay, and this is problematic in a lot of ways, but I think one of the things that you guys know, of course, is that later on, as Hitler is rising to power, as there is clearly a threat in Europe, we're going to see some people want to get out of that, and it's going to make it very difficult for that to happen. So the Emergency Quota Act in 1924 said that only 3% of each ethnic group that was already here, so it took the total number of that, 3% of that is who is allowed to enter yearly. So it drastically cut. This number, what it did was cut it even more. They said, okay, well, we're not going to go with the number that's here in 1924. We're going to go back to the 1890 census before a lot of these groups were even here. See, okay, how many Italians were here in 1890? Now we're going to take 2% of that. So it was a much smaller number than this. And then by 1929, the United States passed a law that essentially said the total number of immigrants for the entire year, no matter where they're from, no matter what the circumstances may be, will be 152,574, a very small number, relatively speaking, to what had been coming before, who had been coming before. So there's an attempt here to really sort of stop immigration with the idea that, well, if we could just stop that, it will keep us from being pulled in to the other conflicts. And it didn't work. We're going to see that. It didn't work. It's definitely something that we look at now and say, okay, it might be a temporary solution. It's definitely not a long-term solution. Okay, talking about our presidential administrations, Warren Harding. Oh boy, what can I say about him? What do I need to not say about him? Let me just tell you this. So Warren Harding was known more for his presidential scandals than really for his short time as president. He will actually die in office. And so he is elected, of course, as you saw in 1920. But later on, and I got to show you this because you really can't believe it unless you see it. They just 2 years ago released some of his love letters to one of his mistresses. There were several. There was an illegitimate child conceived, most likely in a White House closet, by the way. Yeah, keeping it classy, Warren Harding, you're keeping it classy. So you can read these letters if you really want to. Um, Another thing you could do that I would suggest, because this is just really hilarious, is if you search for the Presidential Podcast by Washington Post. These are really actually kind of awesome. I haven't listened to all of them, but I've listened to quite a few. And they're like 45 minutes or so on every president. And it's like the backstory, the untold story. They talk to historians. She always asks, so if I'm going on a blind date with this president, like, what would it be like? Personality stuff you wouldn't necessarily get. So Warren Harding's is hilarious because they actually have a historian read some of his love letters out loud. And let's just say he has nicknames for a certain anatomical part, and it's not his arm. I'm just going to let your imagination do the rest on that. And I was laughing really hard listening to these from a president. So, yeah. So, he was well liked when he was president, but after his death, all these scandals came out, and people were like, whoa, we did not realize that was going on. So, some of this was he surrounded himself with some pretty shady people. So we actually have our first cabinet member go to prison under the Harding administration for the Teapot Dome scandal. And this scandal was one where it was involving the sale of some land in Wyoming. We had illegal bribes, we had embezzlement. So Albert Fall he goes to prison for it. So it's kind of a big deal. So we have, unfortunately, a lot of corruption. He does have some good appointments like Herbert Hoover, who's going to go on to become the president, be Secretary of Commerce. Andrew Mellon, they called this guy the second Alexander Hamilton. Okay, he's got that kind of a mentality of strong central government, lots of centralization under the bank, and of course, the bank here is really the Federal Reserve, right? He'll be the Secretary of the Treasury for all three Republican presidents in the 1920s. Very much focused on supply side economics. Nice high protective tariffs, shut out all the foreign goods. And again, this works temporarily, okay? But there's already signs that there's issues by even 1925-26 because that's going to lead to overproduction and underconsumption. So that's going to be an issue. We are also going to see the attempt through some treaties, through the Washington Naval Conference, through things like the Kellogg-Briand Pact, to ban war, to make it look like just because we get rid of some of our ships, there will never be war again. So there's a lot of this sort of naivete we see in the 1920s, where it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. It's what you might hear is called a dog and pony show. Like they're real good at showing off these things and signing these documents saying they'll never have war again, and it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work long term. You guys know that. World War II is coming. Okay, Calvin Coolidge comes in, says I'm going to clean the house. I'm going to get rid of this corruption. He was known for being tough on the Boston police strikers in 1919. Continues Mellon's ideas, forced out the rest of Harding's kind of corrupt appointees. And the last gasp of the Progressive Party we see in 1924 with Bob La Follette running there just doesn't work. Overwhelmingly Americans supported this idea of business. Calvin Coolidge famously said the business of the United States is business. Income taxes further reduced, a lot of deregulation. And we're going to see the United States also kind of try to smooth things over with Mexico too. So Coolidge was known for really being kind of tight-lipped, not saying a lot. Another thing I learned on that podcast on Calvin Coolidge, and I never realized this, is I think he gets a bad reputation being a president that just didn't do anything and just kind of sat around, didn't go to any public events. Well, I didn't even realize. So his 16-year-old son died in the White House, and he was playing tennis with a friend, scratched himself, contracted this horrible infection, and it killed him. And Calvin Coolidge never really recovered from that. And so, whereas a lot of people said, oh, he's a president that didn't do anything, oh, he never came out of the White House, he was a recluse, now we look at that and we go, there's some signs of depression. And so I feel a little bad now about how I used to treat Calvin Coolidge. I can't really even imagine what he must have been going through. And that explains some of what historians and what people have said about him, that he was aloof, that he never went out, that he didn't do anything. Herbert Hoover on paper, has a great resume. This guy, you would expect good things from him. I always feel a little bad for Herbert Hoover. He is the president when the market crashes, and he's trying to navigate a situation that has never been navigated before. And he really did the best he could. And he even did break with his party in some ways that we're going to see, did more than his party wanted him to do. But it's just not going to be enough. So in 1928, he is elected. He's a dry. Okay, he wanted to keep prohibition in place. He's pro-business. Kind of ran on this idea of a chicken in every pot, the prosperity, and this is he's gonna continue that. Versus Al Smith, who was a Catholic, who was a wet, somebody who wanted to repeal prohibition, who was from New York, a state that had a sort of bad reputation for corruption. Um, and because he's Catholic, he's not going to be able to carry the South. There's still a lot of anti-Catholic feelings in the South. So we do see Hoover kind of come out swinging here and try to get some really good domestic policies going. But of course, he's inaugurated in early 1929, and then as we're going to see, the market crashes. And Hoover's reaction is he's going to do the best he can, but he's not going to do what needs to be done. And we know that now. It's easy for us to say, right? So we want to look at Herbert Hoover with a critical but also a fair eye and try to kind of see, what went wrong there? What could he have done? And contrast him with FDR. So here are some of the reasons of the Depression. Okay, the Depression doesn't come out of nowhere. The Depression is a long time coming, and that's what we're going to see in our next show. So we will stop there for now.